talk of neoliberalism is everywhere. You've heard its echo from Occupy Wall Street to Bernie Sanders to many on the far right. But what does it mean? And why has it continued to hold so much resonance in the popular anti-establishment sentiment? In other words, much like John Wick, no matter what we throw at it, how does it never die? Historians differ on the why, but agree that the collapse of Fordism in the 1960s and 70s was at the root of neoliberalism. Fordism was a system created in the wake of World War II. Europe was devastated. America had unexpectedly seen an economic revival on the back of military goods production. At the same time, Europe, America, and much of the developed world was in the mood for reform. New apparatus to empower workers' rights and public services were created all over the world. For example, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, civil rights, the emergence of the National Health Service, the nationalization of many industries key to the British economy. This all happened during that period. At the same time, globalization retreated. Developed nations began to increasingly focus on internal domestic production through a theory known as Keynesian demand management. The government would play a substantial role in pumping the prime by investing in public services. Unions would continually push up wages, and capital outflows would be managed. Convertibility, even though a reality since the emergence of the US as the global gold standard existed, it didn't actually manifest materially until much later on in this period. Sounds pretty good, right? Massive capital investment all across Europe in the Reconstruction, the emergence of a consumer economy in the US, the 1960s, the Beatles, the growth of the middle class, consistent declines in income and wealth inequality. So what am I wrong? This is a greatly disputed question. Some blame it on government intervention, others unions, others the collapse in profitability, others the collapse in demand, others the emergence of competition. But I'll give you a condensed account. So this system was very much based on massive capital investment in industry and monopoly competition. The US grew by exporting its products all over the world. Its dominance in the auto industry enabled it to both exact tremendous profits and also pay workers continually in line with productivity. A problem emerged, however. When convertibility of currency became a reality and new competitors like Germany and Japan rebuilt themselves from the ashes of war and in fact came out much stronger, developing an advanced auto industry that could compete with the US manufacturing titan, now monopoly profits were no longer a reality. You couldn't charge the prices you used to. At the same time, investment collapsed as the level of capital investment necessary in the post-war recovery was no longer a reality. And therefore, companies failed to innovate or invest their way out of this problem. The only thing left was to cut wages. The problem is, wages couldn't be cut because the unions were too powerful. They could continually demand more wages. There were strong connections between union management, governments, and firms. And so, capitalism was very static. All companies could do raise prices in line with wages. This led to a strange situation where you had very, very low investment, low real wage growth, but at the same time, high levels of inflation. So the economy was dying, wages were going up, investment was going down, and the GDP growth that had been seen in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was a reality of the past. You see, something had to give. Either the companies were slowly tamed, the profit incentive was managed, and firms were brought into the control of workers, or they were shorted. The ruling class decided that capitalism was worth saving and workers were not. And here you have neoliberalism, a repackaged version of classical liberalism that embodied very few of its values but all of its downsides. Reagan and Thatcher, the thought leaders of this movement, pioneered the dismantlement of the regulatory shackles on finance that limited the creation of unlimited forms of capital, that restricted the ability of firms to send their capital elsewhere, and enabled the creation of new financial instruments and the growth of old ones. Think of the tremendous growth in the derivatives market, or securitization. At the same time, they enacted measures that crippled the entrenched power of the unions, and so capital was able to move production abroad, export abroad, to unexploited markets and pay low, sell high. At the same time, new asset classes were created from the sale of government assets and the commons. Think of the sale of water, the sale of rail, the privatization of the NHS. This all created new assets from previously government-owned ones. Now, I'm sure the question you're asking is, did this work? Well, kind of, and also kind of not. You see, evidence suggests that these policies did actually go a long way to restoring corporate profits, boosting employment, and expanding GDP, at least initially. Companies freed from domestic restrictions and the rigidity of the closed economy were now able to leverage favorable conditions to pay low and sell high on an international scale. Think of the emergence of 0 hours, China, Bangladesh, the kind of deindustrialization of the West, and emergence of the East as the factory of the world. This benefited corporate profits quite a bit. At the same time, the fire sale of social housing that happened in Britain enabled unprecedented levels of home ownership. This had a problem, however. Each upside came with greater downsides whose effects only gradually became to accumulate. You see, as industry was exported abroad, large developing countries, with the notable exception of Germany, began to become increasingly focused on domestic consumption. The problem is, to have a strong domestic economy, you need demand. And demand, largely, especially in the consumer space, comes from the middle class. And if the middle class are declining because wages are going down, then they have less money to spend. Previously, this would lead to an economic contraction, as low-income households wouldn't be able to secure the sort of debt that would enable them to continue to spend in this economy, and we would have a retraction. Unfortunately, the deregulation of finance enabled households to access tremendous levels of debt. And so the consumer economy, supposed demand that we were all seeing, became increasingly dependent on unsustainable forms of debt. Now, this created a problem. Companies didn't really have a reason to invest in their capital if they could pay low. And so profits had to go somewhere. This went further into finance. This problem on what we call surplus absorption would initially lead to tremendous overinvestment in so-called internet assets. You could see this during the dot-com boom. Companies use their surplus cash to invest in anything with the word internet. Inevitably, a system based on pawning off your shitty investments to other people breaks down, and this happened during the dot-com crash. Now, the Fed, again, decided this was a good time to push low interest rates. And so what happened? Instead of these firms downsizing, the surplus of the economy began to shift increasingly cheap consumer debt. And that's where we get the subprime mortgage crisis. You see, a shit ton of people were given shitty loans so that on paper, it looked as though the economy was growing, finance was doing well, things were recovering from the dot-com crisis. In reality, this was the equivalent of getting a marker and covering out all the bad parts of a report to seem as though nothing is going wrong. It didn't work. We had 2008, the shit collapsed. Did 2008 lead to a reset? Well, unfortunately, no. As they say, history often repeats. You see, the Fed decided to continue the low interest rate regime that enabled the tremendous subprime boom in the wake of the dot-com crisis. And so what happens? Instead of investment going up, instead of the economy recovering, instead of wages rising, 15 years of wage stagnation coupled with a tremendous asset boom. You see, when you give banks, and by extension firms, a shit ton of cheap money at virtually zero interest rates in an economy suffering from perpetually low demand, then they're not going to invest it in producing new goods and services. They're making enough money. They're going to invest it in assets. Think of the housing boom we've seen recently. Think of the tremendous boom in the stock market from 2008. Think of the massive growth in inequality that these trends led to. And you might be thinking, can it get worse? Yes. Yes, it can. You see, one of the other problems that came from neoliberalism and the globalization of production that it enabled was not just low wages, the collapse of industry, also the fact that it left much of the world very, very sensitive to geopolitical risk. You see, economists who focus on the theory of comparative advantage might argue that economically it makes sense to buy products where it's produced most efficiently and cheaply and have global specialization. This ignores the geopolitical reality of the world. See, we aren't in one big, happy, global family, a government that runs everything, a people that are united by political and social connections. This world is very divided. It's very dangerous. The risk of conflict is very high. And so Russia-Ukraine is a perfect example. Economic logic dictated to the German government that they should overwhelmingly, and Europe in general, rely on Russian gas. What did this ignore? Well, the Russians were pissed. The West had been antagonizing them for decades. They were currently being run by a strong man who cared little for anything apart from imperial legacy, and Ukraine was open for the plunder. And so what happens? They invade, and an energy crisis is triggered. The West can't get energy. At the same time, the developed world is now increasingly suffering food shortages because Ukrainian grain is increasingly difficult to procure. So in conclusion, run for the hills.